Hey guys, it's Sherry Vegas, and in this tutorial today I'm going to be showing you how you can use Jemonite and resin together to make some really cool plant propagation stations. That's a little bit of a tongue tie saying plant propagation stations all in the one go together, but that's what we're going to be making today. We're going to be using Jemonite and resin together to create some really cool and super stylish plant propagation stations. The mold I got off Amazon, so I'll add the link down below if you want to find the same molds that I used, as well as the tubes. I bought them together, and I'm going to be doing half Jemonite and half resin. And for some reason my light just decided to turn on and off then. But anyway, let's get into this tutorial.
These are brand new molds that I just got off Amazon, as well as the plastic test tubes that do go inside them. I got two different shapes, the one that's like a circle but slightly off center, and then the rectangle. I'm going to be using a different version to Jemonite just because Jemonite is so hard to get in Australia at the moment. So this one is from Barnes, and honestly it's very similar. There are only a slight few differences with using both. Like one was with the measurements. With this one it's a 2:1 ratio measurement. So 2 parts of your powder and 1 part of your liquid. So I'm using 150 today. So 100 parts of my powder and 50 parts of my liquid, and then I'm also going to be using some black powder to color my Jemonite, which is what I'm going to call it for this tutorial. But basically Jemonite's an acrylic resin, and that's what this is. So I'm just going to be adding some powder in. This is actually a old powder from Artisu, which is no longer around, but it's basically just a shimmery black mica, which I'm going to be mixing in to the powder side before I mix my liquid in. You can use as much or as little as you want. I want it to be semi-gray, so I'm going to be doing 2 scoops. Now, before you add any liquid into your mold, you just need to add this little attachment in. This is just going to stop the Jemonite from seeping through, and will leave that little hole for your test tube to go through when you do create your little propagation station. So that's a really important part you cannot miss to add in. Otherwise, you lose your hole and you've got nowhere to put that test tube. Now, with my Jemonite substitute, I am just pouring it all into a bigger container so I can mix it up. I'd like to do the liquid first and then bits of powder at the time, just mixing them through. Once you've given your acrylic resin a really good mix through, then you just want to pour it into your mold, and I'm just making sure that it gets the whole way around. Another really important tip when you do work with acrylic resin like Jemonite or this brand is that you need to tap it to get air bubbles out. So I always like to pour just enough to kind of fill up the bottom of my mold, and then I like to pick it up and really tap it, get all of those air bubbles out. It's really hard to avoid air bubbles completely, but this helps minimize air bubbles as much as possible because it pushes them all up to the surface. One of my favorite things about working with this product is there's next to no waste, because you can always have a piece of plastic on hand and then just spread out any excess that you didn't use in your mold. And then once this sets, you can crumble it up and create some chorizo chips. So that's what I like to do when I have any excess to do with this, is I always spread it out and then make some chorizo chips. I'm not going to be using that in this project, but it's always good to have some on hand for a project in the future. And then once it's dry, you can just literally fold it in and it starts to crumble. I left my piece to sit for about half an hour to 40 minutes before I did demold it. Now it popped out of the mold so easily, and then you just need to pop that little center silicone ring out as well. Now to break it, I just used a hammer. It was actually very satisfying breaking it with a hammer. I would say the difference between this product and Jemonite is that it's a lot tougher. So I wasn't able to just snap it with my hands that I can do with Jemonite. With this, I did actually have to use a hammer. It's also quite thick, so that's probably another reason why I did have to use a hammer to break it into a few different pieces. For this design, I was inspired by the Japanese art of kintsugi, I hope that's how you pronounce it, where you use gold to join and repair broken pottery. I'm going to be splitting this off into two pieces and doing two separate pours with my resin, but first up I need to join them back together. I've just mixed up a little bit of epoxy resin and added some pale gold powder from Barnes, given that a really good mix and waited for it to get a little bit thick before I started to use it to join my broken parts. You don't want to add too much because you'll find it will just seep out when you do press them together, and you'll end up with drips going down the side of your piece. So less is more with this, as it will squeeze out when the two pieces are joined. To keep my pieces from separating while the resin is drying, I just used some little containers to hold up the pieces, and for some reason my light keeps flicking on and off. I'm sorry about that. And then I just let these dry overnight. If you wanted to speed up the process, instead of using epoxy resin, you could always just use glue and mix gold powder into that, but I have epoxy resin on hand and didn't have any sort of strong glue, so that's why I decided to go with that technique. Then on my second one, I just did the exact same thing where I mixed up my Jemonite, added some color into it, and poured it into my silicone mold. Then once that had set for about half an hour to 40 minutes, I just used my hammer once again to break the pieces into two. For the next step, I'm just mixing up some epoxy cast resin from Barnes. This is a 2-to-1 ratio resin and is designed for casting items. So I've just mixed that up, and I think I mixed up 150 mils in total. Obviously the measurements will change depending on how much of the first set you're adding back in. And don't forget also to add that little round silicone stopper, so that way you don't lose the hole on your second time. With this first one, I just mixed up a little bit of Barnes black tint, and I'm just going to be pouring that resin into the second part of my mold. And with my terracotta colored piece, I've added some chorizo chips into just some clear resin, and I'm pouring that into the second part of this mold. With my leftover acrylic pieces, I can then make another propagation station. So for this one, I'm going to be keeping it quite similar but changing up the technique slightly. I've just poured some clear resin in, using my heat gun to pop any bubbles, and then I'm using that black tint again from Barnes, this time only using 2 drops, and then going to be slowly working that down to create a swirl effect in my resin. This is probably my favorite one out of the pieces that I made today, just because I really love how those swirls turned out when the resin set. I left my resin to set for 24 hours, and then I just demolded my piece, and I got such beautiful swirls throughout the resin. If you need to, you can then just sand them back if you have any parts where the resin has seeped over onto the Jemonite. And then I just like to give them a seal. I use the Duramax semi-gloss sealant just because water will be used obviously with the propagation station, and I don't want the Jemonite to get affected by that. But I really like how these turned out. I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below.
Thank you guys so much for watching this tutorial. If you liked it, please give it a big thumbs up. It always helps me out and it helps my channel to grow. If you are new to my channel, please do subscribe as I post new videos every single week, all to do with resin, alcohol inks, Jemonite, and candle making. And if you have any feedback or any comments, please leave it in the box below. I always love seeing what everyone has to say after a tutorial, and for some reason my light still keeps flicking on and off. It maybe needs a new battery, but anyway, thank you guys so much for watching.